God. And we're live.
Oh,
It's Monday, July 11th, 5:04 p.m. Eastern Time. We're not allowed to have fun anymore, but our good friend Virginia Heffernan is here to talk to us about the dawn of everything and human nature at its core. I was so glad to hear you say yes to coming on. And also, I am really wondering at the foremost whether you consider this a book review or whether you consider this like a separate article. It felt separate article-y to me, but it also I don't know. What do you think? That's a very small thing.
I think it's a profile.
Yeah.
I mean, it's supposed to be a profile. I mean, I dropped that I left my house and went to Dublin. And I also went out to lunch. I mean, I did some shoe leather for this. I followed around and tagged around with one of the authors of this giant bestseller called The Dawn of Everything that has some huge partisans, including me, and some detractors, including Steven Pinker. And I went with him I didn't go with him to TED because that's a $25,000 ticket. But he spoke with Elon Musk. He avoided Elon Musk. And then I met him in Manhattan. And then I went to two much more modest appearances of David Wengrow, the author of The Dawn of Everything, in Dublin one was a convocation of hunter-gatherers. That's what he calls them. Archaeologists who study hunter-gatherers call themselves hunter-gatherers. And then also these labor unionist hothead, people who are also anarchists, because you know how labor and anarchism are the same, socialism and anarchism are the same. But it actually added up. And it was really fun to see him especially with these tattooed fanboys. But there were some academics who were interesting too and called him out on certain things. So that was what I think of it as, a profile. I should have just said a profile, period.
Yeah.
I would. I thought your description of him speaking at these small events was really quite fascinating. So first of all, maybe you can just say a bit more about why this guy who is really
who this guy is, first of all, who we're talking about, and the book, and what the book is, and stuff like that.
And just how this guy who makes it so big, who goes from a TED talk to this thing that seems so unusual.
Yeah, so he is, I mean, it was difficult to handle something, which is that his co-author on the book is much better known, a man named David Graeber, who died in 2020 just after they finished the manuscript. So they put the finishing touches on the manuscript. It did go through proofreading, but I don't think they changed a word of it. And then he died shortly thereafter under somewhat mysterious circumstances and in Venice, not Venice, Italy. So death in Venice. So there's some wonderful mystery around him. And there's always been mystery around him. You've probably heard of him. He is known in shorthand as the anarchist anthropologist and the author of We Are the 99%. He was an actual activist, though also a Yale academic at the time, who helped architect the global justice movement and Occupy Wall Street. And then he was shot down for tenure at Yale. Thanks, Scott. You definitely did it. I mean, Yale, right? You guys all just together. Who's in or who's out?
Skull and Bones, am I right, man?
Yeah, Scott. He was not up to your Skull and Bones, your George Bush, your thing.
Okay, but just really to be clear, this is there are two Davids who wrote this book, The Dawn of Everything. But there is David Wengrow, and then there is David Graeber. And David Wengrow is the one who died as soon as it was written.
No, the other way around.
No, sorry. Graeber is the one who died as soon as it was written. And Wengrow is the one that you followed for this profile.
exactly. David Graeber, though, was expected to be the face of the project. He's good at pop books. He wrote a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. He wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs. He has an enormous number of fans. He's like a really good talker. He's spoken at Google. He's spoken to, on the barricades. I mean, everyone loves to see him. And he's had after getting shut out of Yale, he's had an enormous career abroad. And he's recognized on the street. Anyway, after talking David Wengrow, who's a much more serious, scholarly, footnoted, or I should say just kind of library academic and fieldwork academic, and not an anthropologist, but an archaeologist with no real politics, they came together to work on this project. And this is just getting to who Wengrow is. Wengrow's English. He went to Oxford. He first in his family to go to college. And now he teaches at University College London archaeology with a focus on what's now Iraq. So anyway, what's very interesting in the backstory of the book is that Wengrow was left with this giant project, as if you were like called to consult on a giant Hollywood project that you made with Gwyneth Paltrow, and then she died and you had to do the red carpet work, just something that you weren't familiar with, but he's pulled it off beautifully, although he has none of the bluster of Graeber. And I really wanted to make sense of his part in the project, which was enormous, and how he's going to, carry this heavy burden of speaking for both Graeber and him.
All right. Yeah, that's actually a really important important point. The fact that he kind of bears the legacy of a much kind of bigger, in some sense, a kind of bigger personality, bigger, body of work, or not body of work, or just following.
Yeah. But I wanted to find out, because there were some early on profiles when it came out, profiles that wanted to do something that like Graeber was all the imagination and, Wengrow was just the facts. And it was much more than that. I mean, they had, not to get sentimental, but they had like real philia, like a real meeting of minds. Neither one of them, was kind of the ghostwriter or just, the research assistant. They both, they had talked mostly in person or on the phone. That's how they did their work together, creating pages. They'd done this for 10 years and they were just in each other's heads. That, like, I don't know if you all remember, but in C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, one of them is philia, the relation between like Frodo and Sam Gamgee in Lord of the Rings, or between Tolkien and C.S. Lewis himself. That like just this particular kind of intellectual soulmate that they found in each other. It's very moving to hear about. And it's nothing like what some of the earlier profiles, and I think some of the early profiles got it wrong with this simplistic difference between the two of them. That, Wengrow was some kind of like wifey wind beneath the wings of superstar Graeber. That turned out not to be true.
It reminds me a bit of the Michael Lewis, The Undoing Project, where he writes about Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and in some sense, it's the same thing. They're from slightly different disciplines, and one's a kind of a bigger personality figure, but they really have a philia, and they really have a kind of a meeting of the minds, and something this huge thing that we now call behavioral economics.
They Graeber and Wengrow take or people call them the Davids, have this very interesting moment. Oh, am I still there? Very interesting moment in the very beginning of the book, or maybe 70 pages in, where all of a sudden they talk about dialogue, not dialectical materialism or something like that, but dialogue at being the kind of central modality of all philosophy and even all meaning making. And they take a little shot, it's not the only one they take, but at neuroscience, because they say something like, neuroscience tells us that our brains can only hold a thought for just a few seconds and that we're always doing all this processing. But one huge exception, and in lieu of fun, is exactly this. One huge exception is in conversation with other people, where we can hold a thought for hours on end, because our brains are just making meaning together with our, even though we're not, neuros mirroring each other because we're on screen. It's just that, and Graeber and Wengrow say friendships in academia are themselves a radical act. Just saying, the conference says we're not going to do that right now. We're not going to go to these talks. We're just going to sit together and try to sort out what this new archaeological data means, and might mean giving the lie to a lot of big books about the origins of humanity, including books by Pinker, Jared Diamond, and Yuval Harari. But they just wanted to take in this research. I think it's true in every field. Research is coming in unprocessed, studies in labs of ostrich shell beads. And someone's doing that over here. And then someone else is saying over here, well, is it Dunham's number? You probably remember better. Dunham, we can only keep track of 150 people. And over that, we need police, we need hierarchies, we need military, right? That was like something passed around in every management book, every kind of blowhardy pro-cop, leadership book in our airports, right? Is some idea that of this number 150, maybe you could have like a church parish, or an extended softball league that didn't need a hierarchy, but beyond that, you need cops and kings. As this ostrich shell data was coming out, showing exactly the opposite, this incredibly interesting thing where it expanded all across these little beads that were uniform in nature, expanded all across Eastern and Southern Africa, and were proof that people were trading and people were doing this thing. These beads are so beautiful and crazy 30,000 years ago, and managing across huge swaths, huge amounts of land and huge populations without any evidence of monuments to kings or evidence of weapons or police stuff that you see in other very hierarchical societies. So anyway, the point is, the ostrich shell thing comes in with one ear. You're still holding on to something that you read in The Origin of Species or Jared Diamond, and nobody puts them together. And so Wengrow had access to those labs, and lab archaeology is kind of where it's at now. But there's field archaeology too, and he had done field work, and Graeber had picked up on it, and had read some of his work, and then said, I'd had my doubts about some of these hypotheses about early humans, but I didn't have the evidence for it. I'm an anthropologist, I haven't touched an ostrich shell thing. And Wengrow said, well, I just thought I was working in a vacuum. Like, I read Jared Diamond's popularization of whatever. It had nothing to do with the facts, nothing to do with the evidence, but I just thought I couldn't do anything about it. I'm just an academic, And Graeber said, let's take this on the road.
Yeah, can I just say one quick thing, just as an interesting aside, but it is a weird feature of American academe that archaeology is often included in anthropology departments. And so therefore, the kind of cross-fertilization between archaeology and anthropology kind of makes sense because they're in the same department. So I just want to throw that out. I always thought that that's kind of a strange thing, that people who study bones are in the same kind of thing about people who, study, social groups. And anyway.
One of the things they really argue, and there is a lot of, obviously, like genetic archaeology and all kinds of other biologically based studies of what traces people leave. But the fact that the cultural traces we leave are often the things made of stone or that last, or bones, or tombs. That the fact that those are the things we leave that suggest culture and suggest how we live together makes it a good union. I mean, I propose that Diamond's degrees or his interest in ornithology and his degree in physiology in the 60s didn't exactly prepare him to talk about the dawn of humans. And then Harari, is a historian, and he read Diamond's book and said, "Why can't I do something like this? I'll take what I wrote." He's a medieval historian. That's his background. And all of a sudden, he's trying to talk about 150,000 years ago. I mean, all of this is just to say, I think there are reasonable doubts to be raised about the standing narratives, and this is what I was persuaded by the dawn of everything. Reasonable doubts about the two dominant narratives of humans in a quote state of nature. I can go into those because I'm like, all I want to do is get people to read this book and talk about it.
I want to talk about that in 1 second, about how the book progresses, just really quickly, if you can kind of explain it to people who haven't read it yet. But I just want to really quick, have you guys, while you guys were talking, I was trying to look something up to refresh my mind, but wasn't there a story, this also reminds me very much of Stephen Jay Gould, and wasn't there a story of him and two other graduate students going to Woods Hole and having access to this huge, and this is how he came up with punctuated equal, this whole entire theory, and they all saw the same data, and then they all went and had 3 huge different revelations around the same data within their individual fields, but it was all based on kind of anyways, I will find it. I remember hearing or listening to a story about it. It's not popping up right now for anything that I Google, so I'll try to find it. But it seems very deeply kind of connected to this. But we talked a little bit around the difference between Pinker and what Pinker is doing, or the inference. You brought up kind of a few other scholars in neuroscience, and what is the central thesis of the book, and how do they go about, what are they basically trying to say as they kind of weave their story that you found it so incredibly compelling?
Okay, so I think this book works best. People look at the big book and they say this needs an editor, which is also okay, and think that it's too long and maybe get bogged down in some of the details. But I actually think that it's a very there's a lot of news you can use in this book. And I'll tell you what I mean. So almost every day you hear someone just casually make an argument, and I'll tell you what happened the other week. I heard simultaneously something about exercise physiology that started with the classic, 30,000 years ago, we were always being chased by tigers, and so we need to something calories and this and that, and that's why we work this way, and our hind brain and whatever. And every time I've heard that in the past, I've just been right, we're naturally being chased by tigers, and I have to do XYZ so that I don't, whatever, because my brain thinks I'm being chased by a tiger, something cortisol, right? Then we were all, that state of nature is very short and nasty and brutish and Hobbesian, right? That version where we're always being chased by tigers, and, anyway, so the cortisol story or the exercise story. Then the other story I heard the next day was a woman giving a talk about a book she'd written on cooking. And it was a very feminist book. And she said, well, 30,000 years ago, we all sat around the fire telling stories. And she told a story that was basically we were bonobos and we all took care of each other and we were in this egalitarian state. And when I heard that, I thought, oh, that's right. Things used to be so peaceful and wonderful. And that's how that used to be. And so maybe we can get back to that state. And I just thought there are these two competing ideas that are just articles of absolute faith in us that, and when you hear one, you think one, and when you hear the other, you think the other, and they have enormous consequences for our plans about the future. If we think that what happened is we were in a state of, let's just call it grace, this Edemic Rousseauvian world where we all nursed each other's babies and made food for each other, and Kate and I loved to braid each other's hair and foraged for, rotten fruit or what, we barely have not a hostile thought. And then something like agriculture came around and, created patriarchy and white supremacy and monstrosity and made us sedentary and brought cops in or brought military in and kings, and it's been a nightmare ever since. But if through education or through something we can only get back to the truth of us, that's one story about politics, and it tends to be the liberal story, right? Then the conservative story, and Pinker rehearses this and Harari rehearses this, is like, we used to be monsters, and thank God for civilization, because at least we're all naturally rapists and we're all naturally murderers. At least it put some handcuffs and brakes on us, because you had to make certain deals you had to make certain deals in order to live or have some enlightenment, kind of social compact. So the fact that those two stories just live, and even if you're working in a different field, you're writing about the history of cooking, or you're writing about what to do at exercising now, and you erect this idea, cosmology, that they consider often to use some of the tropes of the book of Genesis, of the Garden of Eden. It's like a story we love to tell. And interestingly, they argue that women often figure in at the moment that Eve did, at the moment of the fall, which they say is, the fall is always agriculture or cities or the internet, right? All right, you all know this story. What this book does is raise doubts that we were ever in a state of nature at all. One thing they take issue with is Harari saying humans were like chimps at this time, or humans were like bonobos at this time. We were never chimps or bonobos, according to the book. We were always ironic, sentient, conscious, creative, imaginative, always from the beginning. Thinking of the one thing we can say is not that people were bad or good, but that they were always human, and that they were always thinking of new ways to do things, which is what the evidence suggests. And that I find, and the people I saw who like the book find it just incredibly exciting, like relaxing in a certain way. And I think the obligation is just their burden in the book was just to raise reasonable doubts about these two hypotheses. And even if they don't, and it's very well footnoted, but I've seen people have problems with certain things in the book. But even if some of them are imperfect, the fact that they raise this reasonable doubt about these two governing narratives is worth the price of admission. And by the way, you can get that doubt raised in the first 160 pages if you don't want to walk through all the evidence. They're painstaking about the evidence, but something like 130, 150 pages. So I just found it very stimulating. It shook me out of my dogmatic slumbers. As what Kant said of Hume. Right.
So
you don't know anything about philosophy.
I'm going to Google it in a bit, but it really does matter a lot politically, which is what's so kind of confounding about the current debate. So, like, on the one hand, you might think like the Hobbesian conservative story is like, there's just a limit to what government can do and what human beings working together can do. So settle for, this amount. And if you're the Rousseauian and you're thinking that it's capitalism has kind of squashed our sense of, what we could be, it's not like, this is not like the ceiling. It's like here, so we should really not settle. We should go for a lot.
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which I think the Dawn of Everything, while kind of skirting the two different narratives about human nature, definitely takes side with the plasticity, or kind of, there's a lot bigger, a larger range. And so therefore giving people reason to engage in political action, because you're not, capitalism isn't like what, Weber called the iron cage.
Yeah.
And so it really, so the people who want to believe that political change is possible, and that not just political change, but kind of dramatic, radical political change, you're going to really like this story, right?
I mean, I
wait, just to be clear, which story? The new story?
Yes, this new story. This new story.
Right. Okay. Right.
I like that. I like your point, and I think in a way you're arguing that this just reinscribes one of the stories, namely the Rousseauvian story, and the fact that David Graeber has written fondly about the French Revolution, the fact that he's an anarchist would suggest he leans in that direction. I will say that this is not a dare to dream. It doesn't go so far as dare to dream. And let me back up for a sec. I think there are people on the left who also accept a Hobbesian view. So these are people who, for very good reasons, believe that racism and patriarchy are all but intractable, right? Like, we're not talking about like a liberation, a huge, vast, ecstatic liberation movement. We're talking about like, this isn't really going anywhere, and racists are just solid. And, we're never gonna, we're not in some like Christian Martin Luther King moment. We're in a moment of like, what are we gonna do as women, some kind of separatism or whatever. Just a kind of like, let's make the best of this, shitty hand we've been dealt because we're all animals.
Right.
So it's not only, I think, the right that gets into that, but this is not French Revolution thinking about dare to dream. It is simply the idea that there are alternatives, which is what has become one of the rallying cries of some of the younger fans of the book. So
I mean, like in this sense is why it kind of challenges Pinker, because Pinker kind of eschews this a little bit, the idea of free will and this ability to kind of escape these things, or is it because like I'm just trying to kind of like fit in together of all of the things that like all of these people are that were like these, and they all did, like they're all, like I'm trying to figure out what exactly would piss Steven Pinker off about this book, like in particular.
So I mean, Steven Pinker's ideas that the world is, I would so much rather talk about Wengrow and Graeber, but just very schematically, Pinker's idea that, the world is getting better because, whatever, like the Monty Python thing of like the Romans, they put in, whatever, irrigation or whatever, aqueducts, the Romans.
Yeah. It's like the world is constantly better than the world it was before us.
Right. Yeah. The world, and it's with its free market and with its hierarchy, like it was all rolling toward that teleologically. Everything's getting better and better because like, the right guys got in charge and invented nation states and our kings and our, and the bosses are in control and capital is, in the hands of the most qualified people to handle it. And, there are these hierarchies that happen to, as a side effect, have made things, better for enfranchise more people. And I can see that case, right? But they're not arguing, but Wengrow and Graeber are not arguing things are getting better or things getting worse. They believe that intrinsically things are changeable. And it's just very hard to see things that way. But I'll give you the book is filled with like these startling insights, but so many jokes. And Graeber was very funny. The case for satire, for example, like the stuff that proliferates online is here made as that they say things like, most societies or many societies have kings, but every society with a king has a fool, because the satirists are the ones that say it could be, we need to bring a bully down to earth, and it could be bad if this guy thought too highly of himself. And right. And so the satirist or the clown or the fool is around, but animal societies don't have satirists, right? They don't see anything wrong in the ones that have, a wolf pack dynamics. They don't see anything wrong with having an alpha. They don't have some idea that like, we need to ironize this or imagine other possibilities. And the evidence of satire is like, it's just fantastic. I mean, I hope that I'm making it clear how interesting that point is.
No. I mean, it's clear.
Are.
I'm just kind of like, okay. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
No, I was just going to say that was really interesting, and I thought you said it particularly clearly. I only saying that because you asked, But
yeah.
go ahead.
I thought it was really and it's
no, I guess like, but I kind of think so. So there's kind of like, I'm understanding the premise of this book to be like, well, we have this Hobbesian version or this Rousseau version, or like then like they both live simultaneously in their heads, and like yet we're able to hold on to both of them at the same time about the nature and history of humanity.
Yeah.
And they're not just saying, like, I just want to be clear that like the Davids are not saying, oh no, it's both. They're not exactly saying that. No. They're not saying it's both all the time. They're like, because that's kind of where I would go. And that's maybe a little bit what you think Pinker goes, which is with his kind of like, you know, this balancing thing of like kind of like getting towards a better equilibrium, but a constant like movement and change towards equilibrium. They're saying, like, if you had to put it on, like, if you had to describe the graph of humanity, what would it look like according to the Davids? Like, would it be a logarithmic curve? Like, no. What is like going on?
No bending toward justice or bending toward nightmares or bending toward injustice. There is a lot. What it would look like on a graph is just a ton of eccentric points all over, right? For instance, and I'll give you another example because it's so vivid that like talking about you know, their quarrel with these writers, which they don't go into too much because they're so in their research. There were something like 5,000 years ago, and some of them still are there. These two tribes in the Pacific Northwest, Americans have been very interested in this part of the story, Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. And the way these societies organize themselves, and one of them, there are lots of them still there, the Qualkill, I think it's pronounced, the suggestion is that they give the lie to the dominant idea that people are driven by biological imperatives when they settle somewhere. So like subjugate people for sex and labor, try to derive as many calories as possible from your environment with as little work as possible, and a kind of battle for power, right? But also for nourishment and like all the things we think you do to sustain yourself. One of the early discoveries of anthropologists, way before this debate came up, is that one of the groups, the northern group, ate salmon. Great way to get calories, pretty easy to process. But the one to the south, with the exact same, ecology and environment, ate pine nuts. Not a great source of calories, very difficult to process. Why would they make this huge distinction between them? So they cite something that is an idea in anthropology that for some reason, you all probably have ideas, has caught on like wildfire in America among people who've read the books. Schismogenesis. Have you heard this idea? It's groups.
I didn't realize that this was like coming from this book, but go ahead.
Oh yeah, okay. So schismogenesis is like Sparta and Athens. It's like the reason we're this way is because we're not like you. So if you eat salmon, we eat pine nuts. Whether it's in our interest or not, our interest is defining ourselves against our neighbors. So why is this caught on in America? Because I will tell you, the reason I don't wear a red baseball cap is because they do. That's it, right? I mean, I might put on a red baseball cap, except I never will because, you know, I'm a pine nut eater. They're salmon eaters. So,
it is very much like an idea of like all of the evolutionary traits can have like, there's social meaning and tribalism and all types of things built into also, like evolutionary decisions that we attribute to be like, we over attribute to some type of like greater processing or thinking.
The reason I choose that one is because, you know, there's no left or right in pine nuts and salmon, although there's a really interesting quest. But there's no left or right in pine nuts or salmon. It's not like, oh, one people were all great and they sat around in a circle and did kumbaya, and the other one had horrible kings who were rapists. It's neither of those. It's just like weird nutritional choices that you'd think would be driven by imperatives, but are actually driven by humans, the perversity and like humor and, you know, complexity of human relationships that can show up nowhere in the animal kingdom.
Yeah,
people that love the idea that that there's nothing that changes between primates and sapiens.
I'm really struck by the fact that it's not like there are two competing things going on. That is, there are the biological things, the biological drives, and then there's social meaning, and that these things don't connect. In fact, like, think about the things that are the most biologically driven, food and sex.
Yeah.
Like, what is more socially inflected than food and sex? I mean, like, what we eat, what we think is disgusting, you know, to whom we're attracted. This is all, like, so it's just wrong to think that these things compete. They're in fact mutually constituting.
Yes,
or
exactly.
Like, even I'll go further. I want to ask a question really quick, Virginia. So in this like salmon pine nut scenario, like we now know that like there are like huge effects that like having good nutrition has long term on the development of a culture or the development of biology. Like if you have energy and time and healthy children, like if you have healthy pregnancies because you're taking in fish oils, and then you have slightly smarter like babies or whatever on average, or you have cultures where not every man, woman, and child has to be constantly foraging for food, but can kind of, I don't know, develop hobbies, or they paint and make art, or like do whatever. That there are all of these knock-on effects is like too mild a term for it, but like there are these things where you make some choice not to wear red baseball hats, and like I don't know, like that there's kind of that there is some downstream effect that we can't even be cognizable or know in the moment of doing things that is unproven empirically, that then changes and reinforces those types of decisions. Is that making sense? And is that also where this is kind of going?
I mean,
or am I like extrapolating too much?
Because they're really bouncing their ideas off this entirely kind of biological determinism that almost invariably leads to hierarchies and subjugation in the usual story, right? So it's like, I'll go back to the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. And one of the most exciting things about the book is that, like, we haven't, well, at least I hadn't, except in this other Paulette Steeves book, that she's a really interesting archaeologist, but really understood what was going on in America at American archaeological, pre-Clovis sites. So they're like, 13,000-year-old city in Louisiana. This isn't like, oh, really far away in Stonehenge. I mean, it's right here. Like, there was a city that people went to, and it was 14,000 years ago, and it was in Louisiana. And that's like, I mean, just let it blow your mind, man. That's a lot of the book. Like, just your mind is blown. So back to Pacific Northwest and Northern California. This is the wrinkle I was trying to kind of telegraph. So the salmon, they got so much salmon and so many calories in this particular tribe that the idea was it needed to be cured, and then you needed to have someone watch it because someone might steal it. And so that one ended up, that society, which actually survived much longer and survives today, although in a different form, it ended up being quite hierarchical, right? The people ended up being fat is one interesting thing, and that was a point of pride. They ended up being sedentary, the people who got the salmon, and then they ended up enslaving other people to watch their stuff because they were a little paranoid. So so these are the three things the other group was also defining themselves.
The opposite of what I predicted, which was like, oh, they have smart babies because they're eating so much fish.
Oh, salmon oil causes something. I mean, they really are like, let's not start with biology. And it's some kind of like, we know exactly what biology was like then and what it is like now. The things that humans have in common to them are not brain shape or height or head size or whatever. They're our sense of irony in art. I mean, it's just a very interesting way to see things. So the Southern group, I think they're called the Yurok, but I'm terrible at remembering some of these names. So anyway, the Yurok, I think, the eaters of pine nuts became strongly anti-slavery because it was the red hat. So part of the reason they ate pine nuts was they didn't need to have slaves to watch them. And here's another thing, speaking of bodies, they kept themselves very, very, very thin, like anorexic thin, and created these apertures like this big that they would go through to show how thin they were at any given time. I mean, if you think that there's not a distinction, the whole thin Republicans, fat Republicans, like the George Bush people, and then the fat, like, people out in the hinterlands. I mean, like how much do coastal elites talk about how fat everyone is in the South?
Okay, you might slightly lose me. That seems over determined. Like there feels like that particular like fat Republicans, thin Democrats thing seems slightly.
Oh, I'm not matching it on anything else, but I'm just talking about it as a cultural distinction that people like to maintain. You know, anything. Let's go back to the red hats, not red hats. You know, there could be a time where I might there could be a time before Trump where I thought a red baseball cap was like a cool, cute, fun thing to wear. I can't see it that way anymore. Like the color, and that's the same, I think, for fat and thin. To them, fat means, to the Yurok, fat means gluttony, which comes with slavery. But it also suggests that like moral questions are aesthetic questions. You know, biological questions are aesthetic cultural questions. And, you know, you can see that it's important to them because they're anthropologists and archaeologists to foreground culture. But that makes the book very congenial to me, you know, because I'm interested in the stories and artifacts as a driver. But some people say that that Wengrow and Graeber overlook evidence of, oh God, I got to tell you one more story. Is this terrible? Because we probably want questions. We'll go
to questions in a second, but go ahead.
Okay. It's evidence of all this. When you asked where the points on the graph are, and I said they're all over, one of the early things that Wengrow took issue with as an archaeologist in his career was that monuments were always evidence of a hierarchical society, right? Monuments and tombs, and that they were proof that some people were king tut and other people, you know, could just rot. In fact, recent archaeological evidence suggests that many people, they say the majority of people buried in impressive tombs, suffered from or had dwarfism, giantism, and spinal anomalies. And it seems possible there were also epileptics and albinos. So in other words, it might be outliers and not like Mark grandees who are buried in these places. Like there are times when people have, and just even introducing the possibility, you don't need the majority, that there are hierarchies where it's the outlier person that is kind of given all the love. You know, it's the child with Down syndrome that gets all the attention. That is just, I mean, these are the things that may open up the possibilities for, you know, what we might do, you know, and not just on along right-left lines or like liberal whatever lines. It's just like, it doesn't have the mere suggestion. It doesn't have to be this way. Why do we put up with this? The hardest punch the book throws is at Tina. Do you all know Tina? It's probably some of the English listeners do or European. It's Margaret Thatcher's statement, there is no alternative to market capitalism. So Tina is what, in Dublin anyway, is the enemy of anyone, an anarchist, a freaking fascist, Trump, right? It's an enemy of everyone. The idea that there's no alternative to neoliberalism and market capitalism. Maybe those are great ways to organize society. We at least need to imagine that there's an alternative. I mean, how in the world could, what is that, the 80s to now, 40 years, we just nailed it? That wasn't a fad. That's an epic. That's going to last forever. Just even imagining that it could be different is very liberating.
Okay, so actually the one person who in the chat knew what you meant by Tina was Lisa, who I already brought up to ask her question. So Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for writing that article. I saw it there and I was like, I love this book so much. It's like, here's my copy of the book. So what I wanted to ask, I know because you've already been talking about the theses of the book so wonderfully, when you were meeting with Wengrow, did he say anything about how his collaboration with Graeber influences now what his next steps in his research are going to be? Is he now going to do some kind of interesting collaborative anti-teleological, archaeological thing that we should be looking for?
Oh, hold on, Virginia.
I did hear the answer to the question. I'm so glad you liked the book and sort of share my enthusiasm for it. They plan to write this book as a pamphlet. because all they wanted to do was kind of collate and bring together this new archaeological data to back up new archaeological data that came from Wengrow that backed up some of Graeber's hypotheses that it didn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. There's an alternative. And as they were getting into the storytelling and the information, and also taking issue with some of these best-selling writers, they thought, oh, this has space. This could be like a big real book. So they created The Dawn of Everything, but they planned to write 3 sequels, and they were still planning on writing 3 more books. So people have said the tea time of everything, the high noon of everything. They were going to write 3 more books, and then Graeber died. So I don't know what his next project is, although one great thing about Wengrow, who's eminently unarrogant, like for a guy with a theory of everything, I just, I think I say in the piece, it's like uncanny how unarrogant he is. It's like someone without eyebrows. Like, what's weird about this person? Like he just like when one of his talks, he those like town hall mumblecore weirdos that stand up and give speeches at kind of town hall talks.
I don't know who you're talking about.
David Wengrow listens to that guy. He's like, oh, interesting question. Why don't you email me and we'll talk more about it? I was like, this guy is not a TED talker. Does not seem like a TED talker.
Yeah, interesting. Itamar, you had a very specific question about salmon.
Yeah, I guess this is like an intro to a broader question, but the specific question is, who did the salmon eaters enslave?
Thing that's elsewhere in Graeber, but that racism comes like a long time after slavery as justification for it. So of course, like the Qualcool 44,000 years ago are just enslaving other Qualcool. I mean, they look alike, but they'll decide that they're debtors, or they'll decide that they are untouchables, or they'll designate them in some way such that they can be enslaved. They're weaker, or they're stronger, maybe, and better at it. But currency and getting paid for work and debt is also all weird, but they don't get any advantage for, nobody's working, so it's possible that slavery is a strange word for it, but yeah, they forced other people into labor that they didn't want to do.
So I have a question. You obviously love this book. I literally, as I often do, depending on how the show is going, but quite often, have now bought this book. I have to read Scott's book first, as we were talking before you showed up, Virginia. But I'm very excited for this. There have been a few books like that in my life. One of them, or papers. One of them is Kahneman and Tversky, as we previously kind of were discussing. A lot of their cognitive science work, and then and Stephen Jay Gould is also one. So this seems right up my alley, frankly. But I want to hear you say one thing that you didn't buy. In this entire book.
I didn't buy. I think to try to spur people on, and this is a big part of the book, they argue that now, uniquely in history, now with Tina, with Thatcherism, with Reaganism, with neoliberalism, we are stuck. We've lost our humanity because we can no longer think outside the system. Like, we've lost our capacity for irony and satire and for thinking of new ways for doing things. And, I said to Wengrow, you might not like it, but like Thatcher, Trump thought of a lot of new ways of doing things. Like, we might be imperiled, but I don't see us as stuck. That's not the complaint we've been making. That sort of seems like potentially an Obama era complaint in the US. But on the upside, like, whoever thought socialists would make a comeback? And then we have, everyone, like, I just saw there's a Wired union. Like, I really never thought that there would be unions at magazines, at all these magazines. And there's like unions now. So, and then for gender and race to be radically rethought, like just in ways that, we would have thought not possible even in the Obama era. Like, these are evidence of unstuckness. And also all the cults, like talk about ways of organizing ourselves in creative ways. Like we had, an anti-science faction of America, big anti-science faction of America that organized, during the pandemic, which threw up in the air all kinds of other things. We stopped going to school. Like, we are not stuck. And I hate the idea, and Wengrow knows this, I hate the idea that, oh, look at that, they get to tell their other sad fall from grace story that, like, we were just going along like these freewheeling satirists, and then all of a sudden Margaret Thatcher, pushed us off a ledge, and it's all been terrible since. And that I don't buy.
I'm just really quickly, I just say I agree. That's interesting because it seems like you agree with so much of the descriptive work that they do and the evidence-based work that they do, and then like not their normative conclusion that they pull away with at the end of the book, and like the prescriptive part, which is frankly also where I often fall down on a lot of these series. But I'm now going to read the book, and then you and I are going to get coffee, not on In Lieu of Fun, and finally talk about it. And I'm very excited about that. But Scott, last question. Go for it.
I was just curious about you. Are you somebody who likes hopeful narratives? Like, did you was your interest in tech and the internet also the same kind of like the possibility of like this kind of emancipatory or kind of potential to change? And obviously, I mean, it did change. I mean, change so much. I mean, it's shocking the way in which we've changed because of the internet. But I'm curious about you. Are you just somebody who's drawn to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I draw hopefulness I hope from the idea that things are in flux. And also Richard Rorty, my, academic mentor at UVA, I think we talked about him, holds a brief or is excited about something he calls private irony. And so anything that celebrates, like, that imagines like you are semi-invested in something. There's a great moment in Lacan that they don't cite actually, but I think it's relevant. You've heard this before, maybe. A man who thinks he's a king is insane, but a king who thinks he's a king is insane also. And that's like full stop for me. Anytime I hear like about something weird that destabilizes some like, standing piece of fiction or whatever, standing lie that we all listen to at TED and are like, no, that's right. Yeah, that's definitely right. I just want someone to come out and say something like, like some weird line of poetry that makes you think totally differently.
I love that, but this is why when you said this like last part about like the skinny people and Trump, like the skinny versus like Democrats, there is like a part of me that anytime there's like this really convincing piece of evidence is one thing, and then they're like, and look around you, what do you think is happening right now? And I'm like, no, that's too clean, like far too clean. The universe is far too messy. It's reductionist to draw these conclusions.
I should say they say nothing about American politics. They've both been working.
So I'm just throwing that. I'm telling you, I throw out that. Like I reject that premise. But yeah. One last question from the audience. Really important question for both Scott and for Virginia: salmon or pine nuts? There's one in the poll. You can say both or you can say neither. But then I'll hate you because you're going to kill the bimodal distribution. So
I like after reading this, you think that like salmon's a red hat now. Salmon's pro slavery, man. You can't like be for salmon.
No, that hasn't stopped the entire audience from answering salmon.
Okay. I mean, I love salmon. Let's face it. Pine nuts are great in pesto, but salmon for the win.
Yeah, that's true. But there's also that really irritating thing with pine nuts is that you have to toast them first.
Yeah.
It's just that it kind of like, it's just that one extra step.
What am I, some heathen not toasting my pine nuts or something? Like I'm just like in the dark ages, like skinny. Wait, you have to toast your pine nuts? I mean, I know they're better toasted.
Hey,
we're also opting for very little nourishment. So the other thing is I start really into that skeletal look. prize.
That idea that they get all. That's another thing that you didn't mention now, but it's in your piece about that they get really slimy too, right? So that they can wiggle through the hole, right?
In their book. That's in their book. I didn't put it in the piece, but yes,
you did put it in the piece because that's how I know it.
Oh, they go through this aperture, but it's just to show how thin they are. I don't know about the like buttering themselves or something. You might have made it.
No, I didn't. I think it's in the first paragraph of your piece. I have their book, but I read a bit of it, but I don't think it was part of that. Anyway.
I think this has been also, it is always a joy to read. I can just like point to like certain types of like syntax and like language in your writing, Virginia, and I could like identify a Virginia piece like so fast. But like, what did you say? Like the egg yolk yellow ads? Like
I love that. Yeah, that was great.
Like the too rich, too gigantic, too rich, too lunally sublime. Like you are such an excellent writer. It is like truly like a joy to read. And I'm
really interested in more profiles. So if you like this piece, that will help me get more wired assignments of profiles. Because I usually write these columns, and now I'm more interested in like burying myself into other people's.
Well, let's also talk about that because I'm also working on a profile.
They're like, you feel a lot of responsibility of the person.
I don't really love it, actually. It's stressing me out. So there's like, but Scott, do you want me to? I'm not writing it about you, Scott. Don't worry.
Okay, then that's fine. That's what I just wanted to find out. No, by the way, I did look at your piece, and it is you do talk about extreme sliminess you say and prize extreme sliminess, which they showed off by slipping through
slimness.
Oh no, did I misread that?
I'm so glad we were.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my god.
But actually they kind of work. But if you had written slim sliminess, I think I would have taken back all the nice things I just said.
That is, I can't believe I actually, I might have outed myself or something on the internet. I don't know what I just confessed to, but something. But that's it. Really, slimness and sliminess, sliding through apertures, they both work. Yeah.
See, like, weirdness, see, that kind of thing is where like the truth lies. Just a weird misreading that sets us off on another path, thinking about sliminess.
There you go.
Unless you're Naomi Wolf and then you write an entire book on a misreading of it. Sorry. That's one of my favorite horror stories that I try not to think about very often because it gives me keeps me up at night. But anyways, I digress. We will be back on Wednesday. I don't know who the guest is. It will be Ben and Genevieve, and maybe I will show up. Depends on what the day is like. Virginia, this was awesome. This was really fun. I hope that I know that they're not paying you because that's exactly how profiles don't work. But nevertheless, you have made me want to buy this book. So and this has just been a fascinating discussion because I got notes and dialogical
out of it for you all. How you start to reimagine other things now that you feel sort of liberated from those old stories. I mean, that's what I'm interested in with the book, its effect on other people and thinkers.
Yeah. Well, Scott?
Well, we can't have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, I mean, we can have so many things that we didn't even realize that we could have before the dawn of everything.
Yeah, it's true. And pine nuts.
Yeah, and pine nuts, right. And toasted pine nuts, yeah.
Toasted pine nuts. Toast your